so much to Margarita and the Jamestown Foundation for inviting me to moderate this distinguished panel. The panel is focused on the impact on Russia's neighbors. We heard from the previous panelists on interesting insights on captive nations of Russia, post-Russia. So this will be an interesting panel to hear about potential impact of Russia's collapse. My name is Milda Matačiūnaitė-Bois, and I'm Director of Fellowships and Coalitions at Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And I'm going to have a shameful plug. I'm Lithuanian. Somebody brought up Estonia, but and hearing Königsberg and Karaliaučius, in Karaliaučius and Königsberg, Lithuanian first book was published. And it was one of the first countries who withdrew from Soviet Union. So with that, I would like to frame the discussion and provide a few instructions for panelists. Since we're running out of time and we're starting late, I will kindly ask panelists to present for 7 minutes. And hopefully we will be able to have Q&A before lunch. So with that, I will turn to Janusz Bugajski, a senior fellow at Jamestown Foundation and author of Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture. Janusz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Milda. Russian version is available also of my book. I think there's still a few copies left. There's a Ukrainian version that's doing very well in Ukraine, and a Polish version is coming out a little bit later, actually in June. I'm going to be over there in June. So that said, I don't have a lot of time. I may speak fast. No, I think I'll cut it down a little bit, but I'm going to jump right in. Growing turmoil in Russia will definitely impact on all neighboring countries, and it's going to present both challenges that must be managed and opportunities that must be grasped. Some states may be vulnerable to Moscow's provocations, designed to divert attention from its own domestic upheaval. Other countries stand to benefit from Russia's cleavages by easing their security concerns, expanding their influence, and even regaining territories that were lost to various versions of the Muscovite Empire. In sum, and I think this is important to bear in mind, 35 republics, krais, and oblasts in the Russian Federation share a frontier with 14 foreign countries. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was only 12 of the federal subjects of what was then the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, had land borders with Norway, Finland, Poland, China, Mongolia, and North Korea. With the establishment of the Russian Federation in December 91, the administrative boundaries of another 23 so-called federal subjects gained international borders. In addition, it's worth bearing in mind a number of federal subjects that do not share borders with foreign countries have long-standing ethnic, religious, cultural, and linguistic connections, either with Russia's immediate neighbors or with nearby states. Now, Russia's constitution, and Paul Goebel mentioned this earlier, does not explicitly prohibit unilateral secession. It doesn't allow for it, but doesn't prohibit it. However, new states emerge regardless of constitutional provisions, but because of a breakdown in central authority and intense centrifugal pressures, as we've seen with the collapse of previous empires. And I do believe the Kremlin will not be capable of handling several simultaneous secessionist initiatives when state authority is receding and the loyalty of its military and security units is not guaranteed. Growing unrest, power struggles, fractures in Russia will reverberate around its borders. Some neighboring capitals may recognize kindred entities within the fraying federation as independent and contribute to state building. And as aspirant states reach for greater sovereignty, they all seek mutual recognitions with each other, but also diplomatic recognition by nearby states, as well as membership in multinational and regional organizations. Several federal units may gravitate towards particular neighbors, especially those with long-standing, as I mentioned, ethnic, linguistic, and other connections. There may be, in some cases, there may be disputes over territory and resources, could materialize within the Russian Federation. And some new Republican regional governments may well appeal for international mediators or even peacekeepers in some cases, to help ensure national security during the transition to statehood. This provides, I think, an inroad to international organizations, to Western governments, and so forth. Any aspiring state is very unlikely to call on Moscow for mediation, of course, as this would be widely viewed as restoring an occupying force. Some nearby states would be attractive models and partners for numerous post-Russia regions, including, I'd say, neutral Königsberg, Królewec, I can't remember the Lithuanian, Karelia, Arhangelsk, Murmansk, Ingria, Pskov, Krasnodar or Kuban, the North Caucasus republics, the Middle Volga republics, Kalmykia, Astrakhan, Altai, Tuva, Buryatia, and Khabarovsk. Ukraine will be widely viewed as a catalyst and role model of self-assertion against Russian imperialism and can develop significant influence amongst the post-Russian states. Turkey will become a major player with expanding influence among Turkic-speaking nations inside Russia. Kazakhstan and Mongolia can play a similar role along their long borders with several emerging statelets. And while Japan will reclaim its northern territories, I do believe Chukotka is likely to see closer relations with the prosperous Alaska. You know, the Russians have been promoting this idea Alaska should return to Russia. I think actually it's the other way around. I think Chukotka is going to go towards America. A weakened Moscow will also find itself in a weak position when asserting its maritime claims in the Arctic. Don't forget the Arctic. We talk about the Pacific. We talk about the South and the West. There's also the North. This can benefit Norway over the limitation of state boundaries in the Barents Sea and Svalbard, where Russia claims primary rights and access to energy resources. Denmark can reassert its claims to the Lomonosov Ridge, that Moscow unilaterally declared to be Russian territory. Copenhagen maintains the ridge as an extension of Greenland, an autonomous territory within Denmark. And I point this out in my book. The status of Greenland itself may also feature in the calculations of several Russian federal subjects, as its self-government and local control over natural resources, law enforcement, borders, and other domains can be an example for several Siberian high north entities, including Sakha, Komi, Nenets, and regions, non-ethnic regions seeking genuine autonomy and a stepping stone to independence. Lastly, China will prove a challenge. I'm leaving China to the end here. Beijing will try to benefit from Russia's rupture. Okay, they are allies at the moment, but I think they calculate in the long term. It will try to expand its presence amongst emerging states in Siberia and the Pacific Rim, or even reclaim territory seized by the Russian state or the Russian Empire during the 19th century when China was weak. The West must therefore deepen its presence in these regions and work with Pacific democracies, including Japan and South Korea, to establish links with embryonic post-Russia states. Regions and republics in the Pacific region will seek political connections, state recognition, and economic investment. And similar to the Caucasus and Central Asian states, they will resist incorporation into an expanding Chinese economic empire. Very last paragraph, because I know we're short of time. Lastly, the most effective way to prevent any imperial resurgence by Moscow is to recognize the independence of all republics and regions that seek statehood. One must not fear the collapse of a failed empire, but embrace it as an opportunity to intensify multinational cooperation, to open new markets, to facilitate new security or broader security alliances, and to help emerging democracies to develop. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Janusz. So without me even clarifying the questions to speakers, Janusz answered it really well. Just to repeat for the audience, the main questions that speakers are covering are: what scenarios do you all envision, and how should Russia's neighbors prepare to manage the process of coming Russia's Federation's rupture? And with that, I'm giving the floor to Walter Zaritsky, who is Executive Director at the Center for U.S.-Ukrainian Relations and Professor of Political Science.
Well, Incidentally, with the demise of the Russian Federation and its impact on neighbors, initially, I quickly want to just point out very quickly that there's a lot of neighbors. In the West, you have everything from the North Balls and the Poles in the Black Sea basin, in the Baltic Sea basin, to the Ukrainians, the Romanians, Moldovan, Bulgars, Turks in the Black Sea basin. In the South, you have the Caucasus nations, to the waters of, to the nations of Central Asia. In the East, you have China, Japan, the North and South Korean Peninsula, the United States. And in the North, the Arctic waterway, you have that large stretch of Canada on the other side of northern Russia. So my focus has to be much bigger, given the fact that my background is the Center for U.S. Ukrainian Relations. And what I'm going to be talking about is a small group of nations that the Nords and the Poles touted and supported as the Eastern Partnership. That would be namely the Guam nations, that's Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Moldova, plus Armenia and Belarus. For the touters who were the minimalists, this was supposed to become, at the very least, a kind of friendly, neutral belt between Russia, the Russian Federation, and the West. For the touter maximalists, and the people that I met in several conferences in Poland, this should have been the last haul for the Euro-Atlantic world, bringing the six in and making Europe whole, free, prosperous, and at peace. So what I'll do is a couple of minutes or 2 minutes for the collective group and what the consequences might be, and then 2 minutes for Ukraine, because I think that there's an Ostpolitik, a special Ostpolitik that can develop there. When it comes to the collective group, I said that Russia's demise, whether it's in a sudden collapse or in a more tempered implosion, has immediate impacts on sovereignty issues for all six, especially for the Guam group. The Guam nations, since independence, have been plagued by issues of territorial integrity. Not sure whether, Russia, not sure that it can get it all back, that devised a series of hybrid warfare situations that led to frozen conflict zones. We know that Georgia with the city of Abkhazia, Azerbaijan with an older, like Nagorno-Karabakh, Moldova with Prydnestrovia or Transnistria, Ukraine, obviously a fake frozen zone created by supposedly liberated, I guess, Crimean Tatars and ethnic Russians in Donbass. And these frozen conflicts, I think that without Russia's being in play, whether covertly or overtly, I think these frozen conflicts will disappear rather quickly. So that's the first consequence. I think we already noted that with Nagorno-Karabakh. I know that that's not quite pleasant to hear for the Armenians, but that kind of situation has disappeared. I think that frozen conflicts will disappear once the big brother is not in the picture. And that also leads me to a second. It's not just what, in terms of territorial integrity, but the second part of that dynamic is the internal dynamic of said countries. Their politics, their economics, or their culture. I think Ariel Cohen once put it best about the Russian uncles. This is something that doesn't just concern the Eastern Partnership countries. It also, we see it now in Poland and Slovakia and other places. And that is these watchful Russian citizens who somehow are involved in the intricacies of the political, economic, and cultural spheres in these other countries. And they've been there for a long time. They play a very decisive role, but they play it covertly. They play it in the background. I think that the moment that Russia begins to absolutely implode or even gradually implode, I think those Russian uncles, we're seeing it already in Ukraine in the military industrial complex, those Russian uncles start disappearing because those countries are able to fully assert control over not only their external sphere, but their internal sphere, their cultural, economic, and political, especially the economic, where the Russian uncle oligarch then keeps propping up old Komsomorsky elites. And I think with that, the reverse, I think that in the post-Soviet space, that that the Russians had sort of envisioned and stuff. They didn't think that national democratic movements would take air. I think they have. Certainly in Ukraine, the three Maidans of 91, 2004, and 2014 have proved that. And I think that that will happen in all the rest of the republics. I certainly am sanguine about that in Georgia and Moldova. I think I could even be sanguine about that in Belarus and in Armenia. And the Al-Shabaab element in Azerbaijan, even with Aliyev supposedly playing his game and so on and so forth, I think sooner or later. Now, if that's the case, then the point that I want to make very quickly about just the collective group is that at the end of this, if this is true and those six manage to do that, then the plan, that maximalist plan of the people that touted Eastern Partnership would come about. By strong bilateral relations with North America, eventual membership in the EU, and eventual membership in NATO for those six. And Europe would eventually end up being whole, free, prosperous, and at peace. Now that's the Western. And so very quickly to the Ukraine, because the Ukrainians have a special spot. Everybody's right about that. I mean, the fact that they've got a million-man army, and they've got the potential that they've got, and they've got all the values that they've got in terms of a military industrial complex that is now developing weaponry we haven't even heard about. Glenn Howard from here once called it Merrimack versus Monitor, the equipment that's being created, sea drones that revolutionized naval warfare. The Ukrainians have a special kind of little place that eventually, if this implosion happens. Now, there are what I call the three temptations. The first is a good temptation, and that is they develop an polity. They develop as the Germans and everybody else in Europe had, a look at the East and what they can do. If they take, the first temptation will be to help the free nations of post-Russia to consolidate themselves. And so in effect, Ukraine should be the place then that creates the institutes for the training for the new national elites. It should create its own version of Voice of America and stuff like that to blast to the nations. It can play that role very effectively. I think that would be the sort of mentorship role is the problem. Now there's the second foundation of temptation. The second foundation of temptation is as Russia dissolves, let's not kid ourselves. Ukrainians have got territory next door. The Kursk, the Belgorods, Kuban, though I'm not sure that I would want to debate this with the Northern Caucasian, so the Northern Caucasus about this. But that temptation, I would say that yes, could possibly press for that if the place was absolutely exploding and it was low-lying fruit. Otherwise, the temptation is if you really have a Western anchor already and you're already part of the West, playing around with trying to grab territory in a forceful way might be a question. On the other hand, again, I will say this, if it comes to Ukraine, and that these territories may end up, these ethnographic territories may end up with Ukraine, I think Ukraine really has to be very judicious about the way it treats the issue. Much more important for it to support the nations that are yearning to be free and finally be free. Now, the final temptation is the one that Pyongyang once, who's the only true serious Democrat that no, I'm kidding. That is one of the few truly serious Democrats in Russia. He once said that at some point in time, when Russia implodes, and he actually predicted this 10, 15 years ago, there may come a time where there's only a rump state called the European Rus. And it may be terribly tempted, because Ukraine is already in NATO and EU, it may be terribly tempted to try to say, why don't we unite the great lands of Rus? Sort of like the risk board, this big thing called Ukraine, it's mega size. I think that temptation would be a strange temptation. And that temptation, let's put Rus to rest. Even Rus was a very interesting situation. All the Rusi were all interesting, but I think at that point, I think Ukraine would have to give a pass. Go ahead. The ethnic Russians, if it's based out of Moscow, you've had 800 years of history. Go do your thing, but don't come in our we're fine. We're part of Europe. We're part of the Euro-Atlantic world, and we're hoping that someday all of that may stretch all the way to Vladivostok, when all the free nations, that we can extend that in that direction. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you to Walter. We will now turn to Marcin Jerzewski, who's joining us online, I believe. Marcin is the head of the Taiwan office of the European Values Center for Security Policy.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to join you all from Taipei, Taiwan. May I confirm if you can hear me well?
Yes.
Great. Then in my remarks today, I would like to focus specifically on ramifications of a potential scenario of Russia's collapse for Taiwan. And while, of course, if we look at Taiwan from perspective of geography, we might ask ourselves, why would Taiwan be included in the discussion about Russia's neighborhood? And while this geographic connection is simply not there, something that is of particular interest to Taiwan is the question of statehood. And this is precisely because following the withdrawal of the representation of Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China authorities from the United Nations in 1971 as a result of UN Resolution 2758, international recognition of the Republic of China and of Taiwan has declined significantly. On October 25th, 1971, the UN General Assembly passed its Resolution 2758, which stated that the People's Republic of China is the only legitimate government of China, and it effectively replaced the Republic of China with the People's Republic of China as a permanent member of the Security Council in the United Nations, and decided to restore all rights to the People's Republic of China and to recognize the representative of its government as the only legitimate representatives of China to the United Nations, and therefore expel representatives of Chiang Kai-shek. Ever since, Taiwan has underwent a remarkable transformation. Taiwan is known globally as one of the economic powerhouses. It is still remembered as one of the 4 Asian tigers. But I think that equally important is the remarkable democratic transformation. Taiwan is one of the poster children of successful transition under the third wave of democracy that we have observed also in Central and Eastern Europe. And therefore, in the course of democratization of Taiwan, the question of statehood has appeared in waves. For example, following the first transfer of power in Taiwan, when the Kuomintang lost the presidential election for the first time in the early 2000s, there has been an ongoing discussion about the possibility of Taiwan reclaiming some sort of presence in the United Nations, either under its own name, so under the name Taiwan, or under the name of the Republic of China, Taiwan, or as it was stated on the referendum ballot back in 2008, any other name that aids success and national dignity. So all of this is to say that Taiwan, in case of Russia's collapse and dissolution of the Russian Federation, would be looking at how the international community is reinterpreting existing conceptualizations of statehood. And I believe that the main lesson from Russia's collapse for Taiwan will be the practical implications of the theoretical debate between declarative and constitutive theories of statehood. So here, declaratory theory of statehood submits potential states to an empirical test that equates statehood with possession of a defined territory, a permanent population, effective government, and the capacity to engage in international relations, either through formal diplomatic ties or informal, albeit substantial, relations. And As a matter of fact, Taiwan already possesses all of these attributes of statehood. It has a clearly defined territory, which consists primarily of the main island of Taiwan, the Pescadores or the Panhu Archipelago in the Taiwan Strait, and outlying islands of Jinmen and Matsu. So this territorial definition is reflected very well, for example, in the official name under which Taiwan has been admitted to the World Trade Organization, which is the special customs territory of Taiwan, Panhu, Jinmen, and Matsu. It has a permanent population of about 23.5 million, an effective government. It passed the standard political science test of 2 transitions, therefore demonstrating that it not only has an effective government, but it also has an effective democratic government. And as I mentioned, the capacity to engage in international relations. So despite the fact that the Republic of China only has 13 official allies, it is capable of maintaining strong, albeit informal diplomatic, albeit informal and not formally diplomatic relations with partners around the world. Actually, last week, in the context of Taiwan's relations with the United States, there has been quite a lot of reflection about the 45th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. However, in the case of Taiwan, we see that the People's Republic of China is really trying to manipulate the constitutive theory of statehood. The constitutive theory of statehood that holds that an entity has to be legitimized, it has to be given external sovereignty, it has to be legitimized by other states in order to be a state, whereas declaratory theory that I just discussed considers the existence of a state as a question of fact and not law. And some legal scholars even posit that based on the declaratory theory of state, the possession of these 4 primary attributes of statehood that I enumerated actually imposes an obligation on other members of the international community to recognize them as such. And one example that is used in legal scholarship to back the declaratory theory of statehood is the evolution of the situation of Kosovo that started with only very limited diplomatic recognition that grew significantly. But the issue for gaining international legitimacy and for the ability of states such as Taiwan or the republics that would be formed as a process, as a result of secessionist processes in Russia, as a part of this journey towards liberation, is that the United Nations Charter clearly favors the constitutive theory of statehood, given that a membership can be granted by the consent of members of the General Assembly. And here, China, much like Russian Federation, would be very likely blocking access of these newly established states to the structures of the United Nations using its veto power. So in case of Taiwan, we see very clearly that the PRC can advocate for interpretations of statehood that further marginalize Taiwan in the international community. And it is very likely that we would see the Russian Federation use similar mechanisms if it still retained its veto power in the United Nations as a member of the Security Council. While Taiwan lacks official recognition in the form of diplomatic relations with majority of its partners, it possesses these other major attributes of statehood: a territory, a robust civil society, a vibrant democracy, a military, and relations with other states, even if they're not formal. Therefore, an important lesson from Russia's collapse will be a test to the international community. It will be a test of whether states are able to develop a coordinated approach by supporting the declarative theory of statehood to apply gradual pressure and potentially loosen the rigid restrictions that have been placed around states pursuing formal membership in international institutions and expansion of their international space. The declarative approach would enable individual international actors to determine statehood of republics that become independent from the Russian Federation or Taiwan, case-by-case basis. And then in turn, this could legitimize international involvement in case of armed conflict or any sort of escalation from the regional hegemon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcin. We're just trying to stick to the times. We will now move to Brian Glynn Williams, professor at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And I guess Brian has a presentation. Correct. Thank you.
Thank you, Mala. So this whole conference is premised on something that we're not discussing. How does this dreamed of, and I dream of it, collapse of the Russian Federation actually unfold? My talk is going to be a visual, hypothetical journey into how Russia is going to fall apart based upon futurism. I personally, in the background, I used to work for the Office of Director at National Intelligence and for the CIA. And we did a lot of this wargaming to try to figure out how things are going to happen. So I'm going to try walking us through what I think is the most likely scenario for the collapse of the Russian Federation, which I dearly hope happens. So speaking of things I hope to have happen, should, God forbid, this chap die and we have chaos in the Russian Federation, what I'm hoping for is that Congress gets its act together, that the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Matt Gaetzes and the Donald Trumps who love Putin lose power. They only have a two-person majority in the House right now, and Congress passes the aid package. The Ukrainians start arming themselves with F-16s. They couldn't advance last summer with all the Leopard tanks, etc., because they didn't have air support. You need close air support in static warfare to make advances. We get the F-16s to them. The Germans get the Taurus cruise missiles to them. These are bigger, heavier cruise missiles than the ones they have so far, which are mainly Storm Shadows from Britain and Scalps from France. This leads to an offensive on the Crimea. I believe the weakest link in the Russian Federation is, of course, the Crimea. It was annexed in 2014. It is linked to the mainland by the Kerch Bridge and the so-called land bridge. If the Ukrainians can knock out the Kerch Bridge with these heavy Taurus cruise missiles, this will leave the Ukrainians an advantage and the Russians at a disadvantage because they'll have to arm their troops via the land bridge coming down through Zaporizhia. At this time period, we have the Crimean Tatars, who I'm close with, rise up and start attacking as partisans. The Atesh movement, Atesh means fire in Crimean Tatar. They start doing partisan guerrilla efforts. They've done that already, but they stepped them up in my scenario. This is me in the Crimea with some of their leaders who, in many ways, mobilize this highly mobilized ethnic minority to fight against their ancient enemies, the Russians. I took this picture of Mustafa Jamilov years ago. He's still the paramount leader of the Tatars, although Refat Chubarov would probably take over as he's younger. This leads to, I say, an attack coming south with the Ukrainians also getting ATACMS. ATACMS are Army tactical missile systems that can go 190 miles, and they carry a heavier payload than the famous HIMARS. If the Ukrainians can use F-16s for close air support and the ATACMS to destroy Russian logistics, they can break the land bridge that Russia has created to Crimea, and they liberate the Crimea. And of course, go into the Donbass and get the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. As always, when you have battlefield defeats and the army comes home, it creates instability in a country. We've seen this time and time again when defeated armies come home and they cause coups d'etats, palace coups. Dmitry Medvedev, who survives, is not as strong as Putin. They call him Putin's shadow. He's much weaker. He doesn't have strong support. He's tried talking about dropping nuclear weapons, but he's a weak person. I think the military will try doing a coup d'etat against Dmitry Medvedev. They will blame the civilian leadership for the battlefield losses in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, and they will try overthrowing Medvedev, much as Yevgeny Prigozhin did. I wish he won last August, when he marched up through Rostov-on-Don and almost got to Moscow. In this case, my general who comes to try doing a Wagner-style coup d'etat of the government is going to be General Surovikin. They call him General Armageddon. He's popular among the troops. He led the war to destroy Aleppo. He got Palmyra from ISIS, and he went down the Merv and got Deir ez-Zor. The troops like Surovikin. He organized a successful withdrawal of Russian troops from Kherson across the river. He dug the famous Surovikin line. He has much more popularity among the troops than any general I know of in Russia today. Far more than, for example, Gerasimov, or God forbid, Shoigu, who's a civilian prancing around pretending to be a general. So I put my money on Surovikin, who's under house arrest right now for his role in the Wagner approach from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow. He's a man who I think will overthrow Medvedev. This leads us to the Caucasus. Without a strong central government supporting Ramzan Kadyrov, without that patronage, he starts losing money. The whole system in Chechnya is based upon bribery. Kadyrov bribes the Tayyip's, the clans, and they get tired of having no money. We have Chechens who come back, Circassians come back from the diaspora, my colleague Fatima's people. There's a large diaspora of Circassians living in Turkey, millions. Turkey, I met them in Kafr Kama, Israel, Jordan. They start migrating back to Circassia. They've been denied the right to return to their homeland by the Russians ever since the 1864 genocide, but they are mobilized and they start returning back to the Caucasus. This man on my side right here then becomes leader of the Chechens, Akhmed Kadyrov. He takes over because Zakayev is a moderate nationalist. He comes back from exile in London and leads the Chechens in overthrowing Kadyrov because he has no more patronage from Moscow. Kadyrov dies much as his father did, Akhmed Kadyrov, hopefully in a bombing. The Chechens who've been fighting in Ukraine are demobilized, and they come back home and help Kadyrov establish a democracy. Ichkeria is reborn again. Zakayev, that's a Freudian tumble. Zakayev comes back and overthrows Kadyrov, sorry. And we have a moderate democratic government. I'm friends with members from the Chechen Democratic Party, and they're striving to end all this foreign Wahhabism that Kadyrov has implemented Sharia law. It doesn't belong in Chechnya. They never had this in their Naqshbandi Sufi traditions. Circassians come back in large numbers. Remember, there are millions, especially in Turkey, what they call Cherkezler. And they rebuild their nation much as the Jews rebuilt Israel, coming in aliyahs, in waves, to rebuild Israel. Dagestanis, they have been revolting for the last 2 years because they're dying disproportionately in large numbers as cannon fodder, joining these meat waves of people attacking places like Bakhmut. They're dying in large numbers for Putin's war. They revolt, and they have a jihad. They're more Islamically based. They recreate the imamates. Remember the Caucasus imamate for a while there, and they recreate a sort of multi-ethnic imamate led by the dominant ethnic Avars. Which brings me to the large number of Tatars. 4 million Tatars in Russia. They had autonomy in the 1990s when Mizmir Shemiev ran Tatarstan. They're oil rich. They revolt to get their autonomy back. The Bashkirs join them, the fourth largest ethnic group in Russia, and the Volga region becomes liberated under Bashkirs and Tatars. Tatars, once again, have the 4% of the population of Russia are Tatars. The ethnic implosion spreads to Buryatia. They've also been dying, and the Tuvans, Mongol Buddhists, have been dying disproportionately as cannon fodder in a war being waged that they don't really have a dog to fight in this war. They're angry about being used as cannon fodder. They revolt too. There's anti-war Buryats. And of course, I'm not going to go into the regionalism, the far distances in the Far East. There have been anti-war protests, pro-environment protests in Siberia in the last year. The country sort of implodes in a regional basis, in addition to the ethnic basis, all stemming from these battlefield defeats due to America getting its act together and finally acting as the arsenal of democracy, which it always was under Ronald Reagan, and this insidious Trump love for Putin comes to an end. We arm the Ukrainians with everything they need, from Taurus missiles to F-16s. They do a draft. They bring in hundreds of thousands of young people. They lower the draft age to 21, and they resist, and they break through the Surovikin line and get to Azov, and that brings down the whole house of cards. I'll do a shameless plug here to end. Should you be interested in buying a book that's like, it's part, thank you, it's part Harry Potter, 50 Shades of Grey. Thank you, I appreciate that. And that's finally another book I've written about the Chechens, who I love so much, and I'm rooting for them to regain Ishkeria and the Vainak people to be free. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We still have 4 presentations, so we will move right to Fatima Tlis, who is the editor of Voice of America and polygraph.info.
I'd like to begin by thanking the Jamestown Foundation for hosting this event. It's important, and everybody in this audience recognizes that. I also would like to greet my panel, my colleagues at the panel. With some of them, we spoke at many other places, and I'm glad to be with you again today. To begin, I have to make a disclaimer. My views and opinions do not represent those of the US government and the Voice of America. That is because my organization is funded by the American government. For the last, since 2016, I've been leading the Voice of America's first anti-disinformation unit, which was at the beginning focused completely on Russia and Russian disinformation and propaganda. The term Russian hybrid war is familiar to most of the world, mainly in association with the assassination, association with the current events or the Soviet period. However, Moscow has been engaged in a hybrid wars against its non-Russian citizens since the time of its expansion and colonization of those nations. This hybrid war uses different strategies, tactics, and tools specifically designed for specific nations. Yet all those hybrid wars have a single goal, which is a total elimination of national identities and complete Russification of all colonized nationalities. This policy does not depend on the regime change in Moscow. It's systematic, it's consistent. It includes historic revisionism, deprivation of economic, political, cultural, linguistic rights, disinformation and propaganda aimed at discrediting and misportraying the captive nations. In the North Caucasus, Russia's hybrid war historically uses the most radical and brutal tactics. This is due to multiple reasons, which include the region's strategic position and the nations of the North Caucasus' traditionally strong resistance to Moscow. In the northwestern Caucasus, Moscow perceives the Circassians, the largest nation in the region, as a particularly acute and persistent threat to its hegemony. That is the reason the Russian Empire eliminated Circassia and removed the nation from the map. And up until today, there is no Circassia in Russia. As part of this hybrid war, Russia also created and maintains multiple ethnic conflicts in the North Caucasus. Most of them are artificial and could be easily resolved when the main beneficiary of those conflicts, Russia, is removed from the play. Others, where the blood has been spilled, will take larger efforts, including potential outside moderation. Despite this complexity, the countries of North Caucasus remain a robust, beautiful region with vast resources and potential of becoming a successful, secure member of the democratic world. What could be done from the outside to help those processes? I'm not a policy advisor, but from a journalistic point of view and from somebody who born and grew up in the Caucasus and spent most of my life there, here are my recommendations. The European Union and the United States should not impose any state structures on the peoples of the North Caucasus. Instead, allow a period of transition. They should sponsor studies to define scenarios of risks versus success, including identifying grievances and the ways of peaceful resolution, economic and political potentials. Create educational programs for people to study everything from governance to law enforcement, diplomacy, English language, media literacy at the Western institutions. Support, including financially, the development of free press, specifically in national languages. Create journalism programs. Support and short and long-term training opportunities, specifically for the journalists in the North Caucasus. Support the inclusion of the studies of Russian genocidal colonial policies and the history of captive nations into the academic circular in the West, which is not the case right now. Encourage a more active coverage of these peoples in the Western mainstream media. Moderate, coordinate, support the society's engagement with the free democratic societies in Europe and elsewhere in the democratic world. Provide legal diplomatic support to the nations. Create an environment beneficial for economic, trade, business, technological development. Encourage citizens' entrepreneurship. Provide security assurances and assistance in case Russia engages in revanchist special military operations. Thank you.
Great. Well,
Thank you, Fatima. And we have a video address by Kazuhiro Ito, All Japan Karafuto Research Organization.
East Asia after the coming collapse of Russia. Since the late Tokugawa shogunate era, in the early 19th century, the greatest threat to modern Japan has been Russia. As a result, war finally broke out between Japan and Russia. In the beginning of the 20th century, 1904. Fortunately, it won the battle. Now that Russia has transitioned from an authoritarian system to totalitarianism and even started a war of aggression, the greatest threat to Japan and East Asia has returned. But what if Ukraine wins against Russia and our cooperation causes Russia to collapse? Let's try simulating it. First, the peoples of Siberia and other countries ruled by the Russian Empire would be able to become independent due to the right to self-determination. Karafuto and Chishima Islands, which have been illegally occupied by Russia, will also be returned to Japan. The circumstances of East Asia will change drastically. Its North and East Asia spread. With the Russian threat eliminated, Japan no longer needs to worry about the security of her northern border. and the emerging nations of Northeast Asia, which desire freedom and prosperity, can be supported by the United States, Europe, and Japan, which is Asia's only responsible developed nation. It will take time for free economics and democracy to take root in these countries. However, if we succeed in this, we will be able to bring a spring of prosperity to the region, not only through political growth, but also through economic growth. Japan already has a wealth of experience in bringing prosperity to countries such as Taiwan, Korea, or Manchuria. What happens next? It will be the shakeup of North Korea's dictatorial system and the spring spread to the oppressed ethnic group in China. Russia's collapse means that the Chinese Communist Party's totalitarian regime loses its largest and most powerful ally. In the best case scenario, the so-called People's Republic of China will suffer a similar fate to its twin sister, the so-called Russian Federation. Hope will come to Tibetans, Uyghurs, Manchus, and Mongolians, and other oppressed peoples. These peoples have the potential to become like the nations that will succeed in Northeast Asia. And Taiwan will be freed from the Chinese grip. If that happens, North Korea, having lost two major pillars of support, will also face the prospect of collapse. South Korea may be able to look after the North Korean people, just as West Germany used to unify East Germany and still taking care of it. And this impact extends not only to land, but also to the ocean. In other words, it is the collapse of string of pearls and one belt, one road by the current Chinese empire. This signifies the completion of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is strongly supported by the US, Australia, India, and Japan, and the countries that support it. And it will be the beginning of a new and real one belt, one road of freedom. However, I would like to draw your attention to an important point here. This is about nuclear weapons in the region after the collapse of Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang. What I am reminded of is the failure of nuclear control after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think it was really necessary to take away the nuclear weapons and denuclearize the entire region with the collapse of the Soviet Union. We certainly tried very hard to prevent Soviet nuclear technology from falling into the hand of other countries and terrorists. But I think we should have been more proactive in eliminating the very nuclear weapons that threaten free countries. I think the retribution for not doing so is what is happening in Ukraine now. Therefore, we should take this opportunity to pay close attention to the denuclearization of the upcoming New Russia and New China. Otherwise, history will just repeat itself. To this end, it is necessary to consider in advance specific processes and programs such as their nuclear abandonment and subsequent strict nuclear inspections. I believe that the nuclear abandonment process that took place in Ukraine and the strict nuclear inspections of Japan to date can serve as precedents. This is a message of me and a message from Japan. From now, as an appendix to this speech, I would like to send the following heartfelt messages to you from 2 locations in Japan.
We will now move to Kennedy Lee, independent researcher, formerly with the Hudson Institute.
Thank you. And thank you to my colleagues for providing such color on the ramifications the future of Russia will have on Russia's neighbors. In my remarks, I would like to focus on the United States' current strategy and policy towards these neighbors, and to emphasize that policymakers in Washington would be wise to act swiftly to maximize U.S. and Western influence in the region, while these states are still signaling a willingness to do so before this once-in-a-generation opportunity recedes. Moreover, I will speak about how it would be to the benefit of these nations to plan for any future Russian scenario, given the intense fissures and instability in the country, and particularly in its outer regions, which of course border these neighbors. In the 2 years immediately succeeding Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, numerous states across Eurasia, and notably many Russian allies with scant history of ruffling feathers in Moscow, conveyed, if at times subtly, their displeasure with Russia's actions in Ukraine, as well as defied Moscow in a number of other geopolitical matters. In numerous cases, these states simultaneously signaled, also often subtly, a greater willingness to work with the United States and our Western partners on a range of diplomatic, economic, and security matters. For example, aside from Belarus, no heads of CSTO member states spoke in favor of Putin's war efforts. On stage alongside Putin at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in June 2022, Kazakh President Tokayev conveyed that his country had no intention of recognizing Moscow's illegal annexation of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast in eastern Ukraine. CSTO members Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan backed Azerbaijan over fellow CSTO member Armenia in last fall's conflict, and notably, the day after Russia led the unsuccessful charge to adopt a resolution at the UN Security Council on October 16th that neglected to name and condemn Hamas for its atrocities committed in Israel, the Tokayev government released a statement explicitly naming and denouncing Hamas's actions. But the tide seems to be turning away from such defiance in recent months. While the groundwork was laid for greater U.S. engagement in the region, in particular, U.S. President Joe Biden's convening with the C5+1 heads of state on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly high-level week in September, many of these overtures stayed at the symbolic rather than substantive level. And above all, U.S. stalling of additional military assistance to Ukraine and U.S. leaders' timidity in enabling Kyiv to prevail on the battlefield by sending the necessary military resources such as long-range strikes and air power are making these Eurasian nations question Western commitment to the region, as well as allowing Moscow to once again tighten its grip over governments in the region. The reintroduction of the Foreign Agents Bill in Georgia, along with the pressure the Kremlin is exerting on Central Asian governments and foreign nationals within Russia following last month's ISIS-K attack in Moscow, are signs that the tides once again are turning in favor of the Kremlin and its allies in the region. It is safe to assume that pressure will only continue to mount on Russia's neighbors to fall in line with the Kremlin's wishes in Ukraine and beyond. Additionally, as last month's ISIS-K attack has been used by the Russian government to intimidate and crack down on migrant workers from Central Asia, Moscow may use this tragedy to bring Central Asian states closer on a number of security and political matters, even if through intimidation. Of course, there should be no illusions that historical Russian allies across Eurasia could have been fully removed from the Russian camp over the past 2 years. Their natural position is to balance between powers. But the failure of imagination from US and Western policymakers to capitalize on this rare window of opportunity by going on the diplomatic and messaging offensive puts the West at a disadvantage to respond to the incoming Russian pressure throughout the region. Despite ISIS-K's public claim of responsibility for the attack, Moscow continues to publicly place blame on Ukraine in the West, even going as far as to recently insinuate that Ukraine is nefariously utilizing the tragedy to boost recruitment for its war of survival. But if anything, it is Moscow who has emboldened extremists in its immediate neighborhood and beyond in recent years. The Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in August 2021 has allowed the country to once again become a breeding ground for extremism, and particularly for ISIS-K. But the Russian government, no doubt motivated by its deep loathing for the United States and US-led alliance structure, embraced the Taliban in its rise back to power in August 2021. One day after the Taliban retook Kabul, the Russian ambassador to Afghanistan praised the group and called its actions good, positive, and businesslike. And the Kremlin has since finalized a series of deals with the Taliban to supply Afghanistan with gas, diesel, wheat, and more. Meanwhile, while the Russian government is putting pressure on its Tajik counterparts in the wake of the attack carried out by Tajik nationals, as well in some cases denying Tajik migrant workers entry into Russia and even deporting others, Western analysts and policymakers should remember that while the Russian government welcomed the Taliban back to power in late summer and fall of 2021, it was Tajikistan that most resisted the Taliban's return to the community of nations and was even dubbed the Taliban's toughest critic for its efforts. All the more, the Kremlin has emboldened extremists elsewhere. Russia was the first country to welcome a delegation of Hamas officials just weeks after the terrorist group carried out its brutal attack across southern Israel. And Ukrainians know all too well the extent of Russia's growing partnership with the Islamic Republic of Iran, as Russia continues to strike Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure with the Iranian-made Shahed drones. In December 2023, it was estimated that Russia had fired a total of 6,700 Shahed drones at Ukraine during its then 22-month full-scale invasion. While the Kremlin continues to put misplaced blame on Ukraine, the West, Central Asian states, and Central Asian nationals for this extremism, the United States and European partners should use this time to boost strategic and diplomatic ties with Russia's neighbors, including ramping up intelligence sharing efforts, and before the Kremlin's pressure is too much to resist. It is also easy to envision a scenario in which the Kremlin uses this to further clamp down on ethnic and religious minorities along its periphery, which Western societies and NGOs should diligently track and shed light on. Overall, as I argued in a report co-authored with my former colleague Luke Coffey at the Hudson Institute earlier this year, the United States needs to go on the diplomatic offensive across Eurasia, which can take many different forms. A few ideas we propose are to bolster engagement with the Organization of Turkic States, think creatively and substantively about the C5+1, engage with the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, and go on the communications offensive in more Eurasian languages. Most importantly, the United States should change strategy and enable Ukraine to prevail and not merely survive on the battlefield. Greater American engagement in the region would be mutually beneficial, as well as provide a buffer and help Russia's neighbors prepare for any possible scenario involving the future of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Kennedy. I know that we're out of time, but I got a green line for Margarita to extend for a few minutes. I know you're anxious to get to lunch. We have an online presentation by Tasha Bayin, representing Movement for Independence of Manchuria.
All right, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Tasha Bayin from the Congress of Manchuria. I believe you don't need a PhD in anthropology and history to know where Manchuria is. But I'm sure a lot of you did have a PhD in history and anthropology. Let's first look at the history of Manchuria. Manchuria had built a strong bond with other nations from as early as the 20th century. Even back in Qing Dynasty, the United States of America has already built 3 consulate buildings in the major cities of Manchuria. One of them is still operating until today, which is the General Consulate of Shenyang, also known as Mokdin. Even under the occupation of the Japanese Empire, the United States of America was also the biggest consumer of agricultural goods of Manchuria. And during the World War II, Manchuria provided asylum to Jewish communities from Eastern Europe, also the Tatar community. The Jewish temple and the Tatar mosque is still operating until today in the northern Manchuria. And also, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is still operating by the local Manchurian Orthodox Christians. Even under the occupation of the Communist China, the people of Manchuria, we did not lose our hope and our tradition of freedom and self-reliance. In 1989, the people of Manchuria spontaneously formed different kinds of resistance organizations, even militias, against the tyrannical occupation of China. Of course, we did that because of our tradition. However, we cannot made into that way without the cultural influence of the Western nations. In the 1990s, because of the discriminatory economic policies and the cultural genocide, thousands of people lost their home, their work, and even some of them committed suicide because they cannot afford to live. Even today, as an Aboriginal member of the Manchurian community, I cannot freely study my language without the censorship and the surveillance of the authority. However, the people of Manchuria, we did not lose our hope. Our overseas community, we formed a congress and we worked collaboratively with other free nations around the world. Manchuria was the neighbor of Japan, South Korea, North Korea, Sakha Republic, and Buryatia. Our industry capacity is similar as Kuwait, Ukraine, and France. The amount of fossil fuel production is similar with Kuwait, and the amount of agricultural good is similar with Ukraine and France. We believe Manchuria should be responsible to the stability and the prosperity of Northern Asia, and we are willing to work with other free nations from the East and the West to achieve our goal. Let's work together and make our nation free again. Thank you very much, and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you, Tasha. Thanks to everybody. Thank you, the audience and the speakers. And I would like to invite everybody to join me for the round of applause. And I'm sorry we ran out of time of Q&A.
Thanks.